Tonight we're leaving the cities behind. No stone walls, no palaces, just wind, open land, and distant hills that never seem to get closer. We're going back to the steppe, to a world shaped by horses, by families in motion, and by a name that once changed everything, Genghis Khan. From life before the conquests, to the rise of a Khan, to the empire that stretched farther than any before it, and then quietly splintered like dry grass underfoot. So settle in, take a slow breath. Let the horizon stretch out in your mind, because tonight you are among the Mongols. You wake with the sun, no clock, just the low light creeping under the felt roof. Your home is round, a yurt, built to come apart and go back together again. There's no foundation, no walls of stone, just a frame, a door, and a place for fire. It isn't much, but it's yours, and it's where your family is. Outside, the land rolls in every direction. Low hills, grasses, dust trails left by hooves. It doesn't look like a kingdom, but this is your world, and it's all you need. You live with the herd, sheep, goats, sometimes cattle, sometimes camels. They feed your family, give milk, give meat, and their movement shapes yours. Spring to summer, summer to autumn, then back again. Always watching the sky, listening to the grass, knowing where the wind comes from. You've ridden since you were small. No one taught you, not formally. You just got on the horse one day and learned what balance felt like. Now you ride like you walk, natural, without thinking. You don't race. There's no finish line, you just move. Each family travels alone, but no one is truly isolated. There are clans, kinship lines, feuds, marriages, ties that stretch and tangle and shift with the season. Today's friend might be tomorrow's rival, and vice versa. It depends on grazing land, on honour, on memory. There is no king here, no flag, no law written on paper, but there are rules, spoken, understood. Don't steal horses, don't break oaths, respect elders. If there's conflict, it's handled with negotiation, or arrows, sometimes both. You don't have much, but what you do have, you take care of. Your bow is wrapped and hung near the door. Your horse's tack is cleaned by hand. Your word is your property. You don't ask for more, because here enough is plenty. His name wasn't Genghis, not yet. He was born Temujin, named, it said, after a captured enemy. The year was sometime around 1162. The place, a quiet part of the steppe like any other. No monument marks it, just open land, grass, sky. His father was a chief of a minor clan. His mother, a strong woman taken in marriage not through alliance but abduction. As was custom then, that was the world Temujin entered. A place where loyalty was shifting, where honour was personal, and where power was never guaranteed. He was the third of 5 brothers. There were sisters too, and servants, and adopted kin, and rivals, even within the tent. His early life wasn't easy, but no one's was. The family moved with the seasons. They hunted, they herded, they endured. Temujin learned to ride young, to shoot, to track, to listen. He watched his father negotiate with other clans, share meat, exchange promises. He learned that a man's strength mattered, but his name mattered more. Then, one day, his father died. Poisoned, most say, by a rival tribe. Temujin was just a boy, still learning, still growing, and with his father gone, his family was abandoned. The clan turned away, left them behind. Suddenly there was no protection, no allies, just a widow, her children, and the long road ahead. They lived in hardship, foraged, fished, ate roots, birds, scraps. They were nobility by blood, but peasants in reality. Temujin hunted, fought with his brothers, stared into the fire at night and dreamed perhaps not of empire, but of safety. As he grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. He found allies, lost them, was captured once, and escaped. He pledged loyalty to a powerful warlord, broke from him later, married a girl named Berthe, who would remain at his side through almost everything. He rescued her when she was taken, raised warriors from nothing, and earned loyalty not with wealth, but with trust, which on the steppe was rarer than gold. Temujin began to gather men, not just from his own clan, but from many. He valued skill, not just blood. He gave the poor positions of command. He gave slaves the chance to rise. And in doing so, he built something new. Something the steppe hadn't seen before. Not just a warband, but an order. He wasn't a Khan yet, but those who followed him already called him leader, because he gave them what they needed: structure, loyalty, and hope that maybe, for once, they could fight for something greater than survival. By his mid-30s, Temujin had survived everything the steppe could throw at him. Betrayal, exile, famine, captivity. And through it all he built alliances, not just with families, but with entire clans. He promised fairness, loyalty in exchange for loyalty, and no favoritism, not even for his own blood. That mattered, because the steppe remembered. He gathered strength quietly, through feasts, oaths, mutual need. When smaller Khans sought help, he gave it. When they broke faith, he answered swiftly. Not cruelly, just clearly. The old world was fading. A new one was forming, and Temujin was at its centre. One by one the tribes joined him, voluntarily, cautiously. Some were absorbed through diplomacy, others through force, but always with the same message: join and be part of something greater. Resist and be forgotten. In 1206 the steppe came together. Clans, families, rivals, they met at a Kurultai, a great council, and there they named him Genghis Khan, universal ruler, not just of a tribe, not just of a corner of the grasslands, but of all the Mongols. It wasn't just a new title, it was a new system. He reorganized society, divided men into units, tens, hundreds, thousands. He appointed commanders not by birth, but by trust. He abolished inherited privilege and promoted on merit. The old bloodlines grumbled, but they obeyed. Because under Genghis Khan, obedience brought protection, and disobedience didn't last long. He created laws, written ones, the yasa, a code of conduct that blended tradition, loyalty, and strict discipline. He standardized weights, outlawed theft, punished betrayal harshly. It wasn't gentle, but it was clear. And for people who had lived with uncertainty for generations, clarity was welcome. He didn't build cities. He didn't crown himself in marble halls. He stayed on the move, in the saddle, eating the same food as his soldiers, sleeping in a tent like theirs. He was Khan, but he was also one of them. And that, more than anything, kept them following. The steppe was no longer a scattering of names. It was a tide. And Genghis Khan was at its front. Not yet an empire, but something close, and soon. The world beyond the steppe would feel it. The decision to name him Genghis Khan wasn't unanimous. Some argued, some hesitated. Some remembered old insults, old wounds, feuds passed down like heirlooms. But no one else had done what Temujin had. He had kept his promises. He had protected the weak. He had punished arrogance, even from noble families, and he had won, not just battles, but trust. That was rarer. He didn't just rule people, he reshaped them. He banned the enslavement of fellow Mongols. He allowed religious freedom. He outlawed kidnapping brides from rival clans. Old customs, gone. Not out of sentiment, but because they broke the unity he needed. In their place, he gave them structure. Every man had a place. Every family a protector, every officer a rank. 10 men answered to 1. 10 of those answered to 100, and so on. This was decimal command, a system both simple and powerful. If one man failed, the others made up for it. If one man rebelled, the others corrected him. Accountability was baked into the shape of the army itself. But it wasn't just about war. The empire he was building needed more than soldiers. It needed laws, it needed roots, it needed trust that stretched beyond a single battle. So he created postal relays, set up way stations, built networks of messengers who could cross the steppe in days, carrying orders, letters, maps. The YAM system, an early kind of information highway, the first arteries of empire. He gathered people who knew what he didn't, engineers from China, administrators from Persia, merchants from distant cities who explained coinage, contracts, grain weights. He didn't just conquer, he listened. He asked questions, he remembered answers, and then he sent them where they were needed. He rewarded loyalty with land, with position, but never with indifference. Even his closest allies were held to the same standard. If you broke an oath, you fell. It didn't matter who you were. And so, for the first time in memory, the tribes moved together. Thousands of riders, dozens of clans, one banner. And the name Genghis Khan stopped being a title. It became a horizon, a direction. The world wasn't just shifting, it was beginning to tilt, and the earth under it was hooves. Once the steppe was united, it did not stay still. The tribes that once fought each other now turned outward, and under Genghis Khan they moved with a speed no one had seen before. The first campaigns were close, against enemies they knew, rival steppe powers, nomadic kingdoms, old betrayals settled with arrows. But soon, the conquest turned toward the settled world. Towns, walls, bureaucracies that had never imagined a horseman could outpace their messages. The Mongols didn't march like other armies. They didn't need roads. They brought their supplies with them, on hooves, in wagons, across land that most others considered impassable. They rode light, they rode far, and they coordinated with terrifying precision. Scouts rode ahead, messengers circled behind, and whole divisions could vanish into the dust, then reappear 200 miles away. They moved first into northern China, the Jin dynasty, a vast, powerful state, wealthy, confident, well defended, but not prepared. The Mongols didn't come once. They came in waves, testing defences, cutting supply lines, taking smaller cities to draw out reinforcements. They besieged Zhongdu, modern Beijing, in 1215. The siege was brutal, and when the city fell, its fate echoed across the continent. Because the Mongols didn't just win, they shattered expectations, then west, across Central Asia, to the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Muslim state with cities rich in trade and tradition. Genghis Khan sent envoys, peaceful ones. The Shah killed them. Genghis responded with an army. It moved like fire through dry grass. Bukhara, Samarkand, cities with ancient walls, libraries, mosques, gone. Some resisted, some surrendered. The result was often the same, because the Mongols believed that resistance should never be repeated. And they made examples. By the early 1220s they had reached the Caspian Sea, a wave of horsemen carving across the map without ever building a capital. Just relay stations, campfires, and stories. Whispers in every market. They are coming. But it wasn't just destruction. Where cities surrendered, they were spared. Where roads remained open, trade blossomed. The Mongols absorbed administrators, repaired aqueducts, reopened markets. Because for Genghis Khan, order was the point, but it had to be his order. And always they kept moving. Because the empire wasn't a place. It was a motion. And under Genghis Khan, it never stopped. In many places, the Mongols arrived before anyone saw them. Rumours came first, of towns that disappeared, of rulers who vanished, of cities where the gates were opened, and silence came after. People didn't always resist. Sometimes they ran. Sometimes they surrendered at the first sight of dust on the horizon. And the Mongols remembered that. Because surrender was rewarded, often with leniency, sometimes with autonomy, always with attention. If you submitted, paid tribute, offered hostages, the Mongols moved on. You lived. But if you resisted, once, the retribution was absolute. This wasn't cruelty, not to them, it was policy. Terror was a message, a system of communication that worked faster than any envoy. They didn't have to conquer every city, they just had to convince the next one that it was already lost. But it wasn't all blood and fire. Where the Mongols settled, they opened roads, they repaired caravan routes, standardized taxes, reduced corruption. They didn't demand cultural conversion. They didn't dismantle local customs. You could keep your gods, you could speak your language, you could govern your people so long as you didn't resist and paid your dues. In cities like Samarkand and Nishapur, they took scholars, craftsmen, engineers. They sent them east to improve siege weapons, to plan bridges, to carve canals. And in return, they brought paper, gunpowder, silk systems of law. It wasn't an empire of monuments, it was an empire of movement. Everything in motion, people, goods, ideas, fear. They sent a raiding force as far as Kiev. They crossed into Georgia, into Armenia, brushing the edge of Europe. Kings heard their name and signed treaties before ever seeing a Mongol. Because word travelled faster than the army, and that was by design. And yet, they rarely stayed. They burned, they passed through, they demanded loyalty, but they didn't plant flags, no palaces, no new cities named for themselves, just roads, just oaths, just memory. Because Genghis Khan's empire wasn't built to rest, it was built to move. By the late 1210s, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Yellow River to the far corners of Central Asia. But Genghis Khan wasn't finished. He never said so, not in writing. But his actions told the story. In 1226 he turned south, toward the Western Xia, a kingdom in what is now northwestern China. They had resisted, offered support to his enemies, hesitated when he called for aid. To Genghis that meant one thing: they had chosen to stand apart. So he rode again. The campaign was deliberate, measured. Cities fell, forts surrendered, the kingdom fractured, and still he pressed on. He was in his 60s now, older than many riders around him, but still commanding, still moving. There are stories of him falling from his horse, of injuries, of illness. No one knows for sure, because the Mongols kept his condition quiet, as they always did. Weakness, even in a Khan, was dangerous to admit. He died in 1227. Where, we don't exactly know. How, we're not sure either. The stories vary. A fall, a fever, a wound reopened. One tale says he was struck during battle and held on until victory was assured. Another says he simply slipped away, quietly, like a fire dimming after a long ride through the night. His body was taken north, buried in secret, no tomb, no marker. Some say his funeral procession killed everyone it passed to keep the location unknown. Others say the river Selenga was diverted and he was buried beneath it. But the truth? It's still hidden. Somewhere, beneath forest and steppe, beneath silence and time. The man who reshaped the map still rests. But before his death, he chose successors. He didn't divide the empire evenly. He appointed his third son, Ogedei, as Great Khan. Others would rule as Khans of their own domains, but Ogedei would inherit the mantle, because what Genghis built wasn't meant to die with him. And so, even as he passed, the empire rode on, not toward decline, not yet, but toward expansion. Bigger, farther, faster. When Ogedei became Great Khan, the empire didn't rest. It gathered, planned, and turned west. There was no capital in the traditional sense, no Rome, no city at the centre, but there was a court, a felt throne, and orders that stretched across a continent. The first major campaign under Ogedei was aimed at Eastern Europe. The generals were his nephews, sons of Genghis, men raised in the saddle, taught that the world could and should be crossed. Among them, Batu Khan, leader of the Golden Horde. They began in the steppe of southern Russia, where fragmented principalities ruled by princes of Kievan Russes were already in conflict with one another. The Mongols moved like a tide. They crossed frozen rivers in winter, something no one thought possible. They fought in snow, fought through forests, used speed in a landscape that wasn't made for cavalry. They took Ryazan, then Suzdal, then Kiev, burned, broken, left to silence. The princes fled. Some surrendered. Some were simply never heard from again. Then the Mongols turned toward Hungary and Poland. European armies gathered, feudal lords, knights with banners, all confident they could stop the steppe. They couldn't. At Lenica and Mohi, the Mongols encircled, cut through chainmail and kept riding. They reached the edge of Vienna, and then they stopped. Back in Mongolia, Ogedei Khan had died, and by custom, all Mongol leaders were required to return east to attend a new Kurultai, a council to choose the next Great Khan. And so at the very edge of Western Europe the army turned back, not because it was beaten, but because tradition called. And no tradition, not even conquest, could ignore that. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, another branch of the Mongol family pushed south. Led by Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis, methodical, cold, patient. They crossed the mountains of Persia, took cities that had stood for centuries, and in 1258 they reached Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city of scholars, of libraries, of light. The Mongols laid siege, then stormed it. The caliph was captured, the libraries were burned, and the city fell silent. It marked the end of an era, and the world noticed. In the east, Kublai Khan, another grandson, would eventually rule China. He would found the Yuan dynasty, move the capital to what is now Beijing, try to take Japan twice, and fail, thanks in part to a typhoon that the Japanese would call kamikaze, the divine wind. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its full height. It stretched from the Korean peninsula to the plains of Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. There had never been anything like it, and there hasn't been since. But an empire that large, even one built on horseback, can only hold together for so long. The next part of the story is not about conquest. It's about connection, trade, governance, and the slow pull of division. Each son of Genghis received a share, a khanate, not a country exactly, more like a sphere of responsibility, a domain to govern, expand, defend. But all still answered, in theory to the great Khan at the centre. Yochi, Genghis's eldest son, had died before his father, but his sons inherited his lands, stretching west into the steppes of Russia and beyond. This became the Golden Horde, with Batu Khan at its head. Batu didn't just conquer, he ruled, set up tribute systems, built a new capital on the lower Volga River, Sarai. From there, Mongol administrators oversaw taxes, gathered intelligence, and reminded the Rus princes who held the reins. To the south, Chagatai, the second son, received Central Asia. His domain included trade cities, oases, the great roadways between China and Persia. Chagatai enforced strict order. He kept Mongol customs alive, and his descendants would rule a region that echoed with Genghis's laws long after the Central Empire weakened. Tolui, the youngest son, inherited the Mongol heartland, the ancestral steppes, the great flocks and black tents and summer pastures. His son, Mengke, would one day become Great Khan. Another, Kublai, would found the Yuan dynasty in China. And another still, Hulagu, would change the Middle East forever. Hulagu's campaign was deliberate. No wild charge, just methodical siegecraft, ruthless logistics, and unstoppable momentum. He moved through Persia, destroyed the assassins, a secretive sect entrenched in mountain fortresses. He raised them with siege engines borrowed from Chinese engineers and rebuilt by local craftsmen. Then he turned toward Baghdad. The city had been a centre of the Islamic world for centuries, a place of books, art, and law, once called the jewel of the world. Hulagu surrounded it, cut off the water, used catapults and flame. When the walls fell in 1258, so did the caliphate. The caliph, spiritual leader to millions, was executed. And Baghdad, for generations a beacon, was reduced to embers. This wasn't just conquest, it was collapse, the end of a world, and the beginning of a new one. Meanwhile, far to the east, Kublai Khan had a different vision. He embraced Chinese administration, studied Confucian ideas, listened to Buddhist monks, and in 1271 he declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Yuan. He moved the capital to Dadu, now Beijing. He ruled over millions, but he ruled differently. His court included Persians, Uyghurs, Tibetans, even a Venetian, Marco Polo. Kublai tried to expand further, into Vietnam, Burma and Japan. In Japan, his fleets were struck by storms twice. Typhoons that scattered his navy and saved the islands. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind, and the name stayed with them. By the early 14th century, 4 great Mongol Khanates ruled side by side. The Golden Horde in the west, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Yuan dynasty in China. They shared a common origin, common memory, but no longer a single will. Each went its own way, each wrote its own ending. The conquest had ended, but the empire, for now, held. Not tightly, not forever, but long enough to connect a world that had never been stitched together before. The conquests are what people remember, but the silence that followed them, that's where the empire happened. Because the Mongols weren't just destroyers, they were organisers, rebuilders, listeners. And once the fighting slowed, they got to work. The first thing they built was movement. Across the empire, they created the Yam system, a relay network of stations spaced a day's ride apart. Each station had fresh horses, food, shelter, and messengers. A letter could travel hundreds of miles faster than in any other part of the world. This wasn't just communication, it was control. A way to carry orders, news, and maps without delay. Next came protection. The roads between cities were patrolled, robbers were hunted, merchants were given passports inscribed with Mongol seals, and for the first time in memory you could walk the Silk Road from China to the Black Sea without paying a bribe at every border. The Mongols didn't just allow trade, they encouraged it, because trade brought information and taxes and usefulness. They moved people too. Scholars from one city sent to teach in another, weavers from Persia sent to work in northern China, doctors, engineers, printers, map makers. Some were taken by force, others came willingly. Either way, the empire absorbed them. They didn't impose a single religion. In fact, they supported many. Buddhist temples, Christian churches, Muslim mosques, Taoist shrines. So long as priests didn't challenge Mongol rule, they were left alone, or funded, because the Mongols believed in many things, but most of all they believed in order, and beneath it all there was still fear. The memory of the early conquests kept cities obedient. Walls were torn down, militias disbanded. Defiance wasn't just punished, it was erased. But if you obeyed, you were safe, prosperous even. The Pax Mongolica, a fragile, enforced calm that allowed trade to flourish in the shadow of a horse's hoof. And the effect was real. Letters from Europe arrived in Beijing. Coins minted in Persia were used in Central Asia. Glassware from Syria showed up in Chinese markets. For a generation or more, the Mongol Empire created the most interconnected world the pre-modern age had ever seen. And all of it was held together by speed, trust, and the quiet memory of what happened to those who resisted. For the average person under Mongol rule, life was often safer after the conquest than before it. If your town surrendered, if your taxes were paid, and if you kept to the rules, you were left alone. You could worship, you could farm, you could trade, and if you were lucky you might be noticed and sent to serve the empire elsewhere, as a translator, a smith, a scribe. This wasn't equality, but it was opportunity. The Mongols didn't love bureaucracy, but they understood its value, so they borrowed it. In China they kept the tax codes. In Persia they preserved the court systems. In the cities of the Silk Road, they kept the weights and measures already in use. When they didn't know something, they brought in someone who did. They weren't trying to turn the world into Mongols. They were trying to make the world work for Mongols. And that meant letting local systems survive, as long as they answered upward. Even their law code, the Yasa, was mostly oral, more precedent than proclamation, more expectation than inscription, but it was consistent, and consistent justice mattered. Thieves were punished, murderers were executed, false messengers were dealt with swiftly, but envoys were protected, as were travellers, and anyone with a tablet of gold bearing the Khan's seal could pass through dozens of borders without interference. That was power, but it was also trust. The empire used paper currency in the east, silver coin in the west. They didn't force a single standard, they let trade breathe. And when merchants complained of losses, the Khan's court sometimes reimbursed them, not out of charity, but to keep the roads open. If commerce slowed, so did information, so did tribute, so did loyalty. And the Mongols did not tolerate slow. There were census takers, inspectors, advisors, tax agents. Many of them weren't Mongol. They were Uyghur, Chinese, Persian, drawn from the places they ruled. A web of managers spread across a continent without telephones, without railroads, without paper maps. And somehow it held. But none of it worked without fear. The memory of fire, the reputation of their founder, the riders who still patrolled the steppe with eyes that never blinked. No one rebelled lightly, because everyone knew what had happened to those who tried. And yet, under that pressure, there was stability. Farmers could plan for harvest. Traders could pack silk and spices and expect with fair certainty to arrive. The empire didn't build pyramids, didn't carve stone monuments, didn't fill the world with statues of their khans. But they built something else. Permission. To move. To think. To carry ideas between people who had never heard each other's names before. That was the genius, and it worked. Until, slowly, it didn't. You wouldn't expect it. An empire built on horseback, carved through sieges and arrows, held together by speed and threat. But within it, quietly, softly, something cultural began to bloom. In the cities that surrendered early, not just soldiers survived, but scribes, engineers, artists, doctors. The Mongols spared them, used them, moved them. A skilled craftsman in Nishapur might find himself in a court in China. A Buddhist monk from Tibet might find a place advising a Khan in the Ilkhanate. Not for show, but because they were useful. Paper moved west, gunpowder spread. So did movable type, and techniques for casting metal, brewing wine, treating illness. The Silk Road had always been a network. The Mongols made it a highway. Goods, yes, but also knowledge and people. In Baghdad, before it fell, the Mongols absorbed its physicians, its mathematicians. Some were sent to China, some stayed to help rebuild. And as the Ilkhanate settled into Persia, they embraced local culture. They converted to Islam, adopted Persian systems of learning, commissioned works of history and astronomy. Some of the most beautiful illustrated manuscripts in Persian tradition were created under Mongol rule. In Yuan China, Kublai Khan welcomed foreign advisors. He built schools, libraries, observatories. He asked Buddhist monks and Confucian scholars to debate questions of law and ethics in his court. He didn't always follow their advice, but he listened. And that mattered. Even the simple act of translation became a quiet revolution. A Buddhist text copied into Chinese, then Uyghur, then passed to a Persian scribe who copied the illustrations and added his own flourishes. This wasn't conquest, this was conversation. Unlikely. Uneven, but real. And through it all, people kept records. The secret history of the Mongols, written not by enemies, but by Mongols themselves. A blend of fact and legend, of memory and myth. It told of Genghis Khan's rise, not just the victories, but the childhood, the fear, the betrayals, the long nights on the steppe when no one believed in him yet. It survived. Because even in an empire that moved constantly, someone thought it was worth writing down. The Mongols didn't build in stone, but they built connections, and those lasted. Even as the empire began to split its lines, cultural, economic, intellectual remained. A Muslim astronomer in Samarkand used Chinese star charts. A Christian envoy to the Ilkhanate travelled with a safe conduct letter written in Mongolian script. In the gaps between conquest, the world quietly grew closer. The Mongols didn't write epics about themselves, but others did. Persian historians chronicled their reigns, sometimes with awe, sometimes with fear, sometimes with quiet admiration. And even when they criticised the conquerors, they preserved their memory. Because the story of the Mongol Empire was never just the story of Mongols. It became the story of everyone they touched. In the Ilkhanate, astronomers worked at Maragay Observatory, built under Mongol patronage. They charted the stars, copied Greek and Arabic texts, created new calendars, blended knowledge that had once been divided by distance and suspicion. In China, the Mongols brought musicians from Central Asia, administrators from the Middle East, printers from Korea. They didn't erase Chinese culture, but they layered onto it, built something new over something old. Mongol emperors dressed in silk robes, listened to foreign instruments, tasted spices they couldn't name, and ruled through advisors who had never seen the steppe. In the West, European merchants travelled farther than before. Marco Polo wasn't the only one, just the best remembered. Traders from Genoa and Venice ventured deep into Asia, their safe passage ensured by Mongol-issued documents written on strips of bark or stamped parchment. They brought glass, took back lacquerware, and ideas. In every corner of the empire you could find traces of others. A mosque with Tibetan woodwork, a Chinese painting with Persian floral borders, coins stamped with Arabic script and Mongol tamgas, medical texts that compared Greek humours with Mongol herbal cures. This wasn't fusion, exactly. It was accumulation. A layering of language, belief and art across an empire that moved too quickly to settle in one shape. Even the Mongol script, derived from the old Uyghur alphabet, was passed on, adapted, preserved in records long after the emperors were gone. To this day it's still used in parts of Mongolia, not because of nostalgia, but because it worked. And the Mongols, if nothing else, kept what worked. They didn't build monuments to themselves, but they made it possible for others to build more. They cleared the roads, enforced the laws. And in that space, a space where for once you could cross a continent without crossing a war, art happened. Learning happened. People had room to speak across borders for the first time in centuries. Not loudly, not permanently, but clearly enough that we still hear it now. In the roots that remained, in the words that linger, in the quiet fact that under the shadow of conquest the world briefly became smaller. The empire had been too large from the start. Genghis Khan had bound it together through charisma, discipline and fear. His sons held it through habit and shared memory, but by the time it passed to the grandsons there were too many thrones, too many claimants, too many borders, and no clear line of who should rule whom. The Great Khan was still based in the east, in Mongolia, later in Khanbalik, what we now call Beijing. But the western Khanates had grown independent in practice. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in the steppes of Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. They each had their own armies, their own tax systems, their own diplomacy. And when they fought, they didn't always bother telling the Great Khan. Succession disputes grew more common. A Khan would die, 2 sons would claim the title, then a cousin, then a general. The Kurultai, once a respected council, became a formality, then a memory. Some Khans were declared without consensus. Others were challenged before the tent was even packed. Civil war didn't erupt. It simmered and never fully stopped. In China, the Yuan dynasty began to lose touch with its Mongol roots. Kublai Khan ruled as emperor, but his successors became more Chinese in style and more isolated from the steppe. Famines struck, floods worsened, the court grew decadent, and resentment spread among the population, who saw the foreign Khans as distant rulers with foreign gods. By the 1300s, revolt was brewing. In Persia, the Ilkhanate collapsed after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335. No clear heir, no strong successor. The dynasty split into factions, then warlords, then silence. By the mid-14th century, Persia was no longer Mongol in name or rule. The Golden Horde lasted longer, in name at least. But its grip on the Russian principalities weakened. Moscow rose, tribute slowed, the memory of Mongol dominance remained, but the fear no longer held. By the 1400s the horde had splintered into smaller khanates. They fought one another more than they ruled, and by then the Russians were pushing back. Only the Chagatai Khanate lingered in Central Asia, fractured but present. Eventually, out of that region would rise a new conqueror, Tamerlane, Timur the Lame. Not Mongol by blood, but Mongol by idea. He claimed descent from Genghis's legacy, revived the tactics, the fear, but it was a new empire, with new ambitions. The old one was already gone. The empire didn't die in battle. It unravelled, like a tent taken down carefully. Each pole lifted, each rope coiled, each skin rolled and packed away, until the place where it stood was just grass again. The Mongol Empire had always been made of movement, but eventually the roads hardened, the stations emptied, the horses stopped running, and with each generation the bond between the Khanates grew weaker. They no longer looked east for leadership, they looked inward, and began to drift. The messengers that once crossed continents in days stopped being trusted, or stopped arriving. The Great Yam system decayed, the relay posts were looted, the guards reassigned to local wars. It wasn't sabotage, it was neglect. And for an empire built on connection, neglect was fatal. In China, the Yuan dynasty began to lose the countryside. Banditry grew, famine struck. The population, mostly Han Chinese, looked at their Mongol rulers and saw only distance. The court was opulent but brittle. By the 1350s, a rebellion had begun. The Red Turban movement. Peasants, scholars, soldiers. They didn't just want food, they wanted the Mongols gone. By 1368, they had taken the capital. The Yuan fell. The Mongols fled north back to the steppe. The Ming dynasty began, and with it, a new era. In the western Khanates, the fragmentation continued. The Golden Horde was no longer golden, nor a horde. Its vassals in Moscow grew bold, stopped paying tribute, built fortresses, declared themselves defenders of their faith, their land. The Horde retaliated, but each campaign grew weaker, and by the end of the 15th century, Ivan III of Russia had stood his ground. The Mongol yoke was lifted, not with a final battle, but with a refusal. In Persia, after the fall of the Ilkhanate, successor states rose, smaller, richer in culture, poorer in unity. The Mongol name faded, but the system they'd left behind, administrative districts, postal systems, a taste for strong central rule, remained. Even among the Mongols themselves, the empire fractured into arguments over identity. Was a true Mongol one who ruled the steppe, or one who governed cities? Was power in heritage, or in the saddle? Some returned to the old ways. Others embraced what they had conquered. And the centre, the thing that once bound them all, Genghis Khan's vision, was now more memory than law. The map still bore the names Chagatai, Golden Horde, Yuan. But the edges faded, the roads blurred, the silence deepened, and the empire, the real empire, was already gone. No empire survives forever, but some linger longer than they should, not in banners, not in coins, but in memory. And the Mongol Empire, for all its speed and fire, never quite left. Its legacy moved in layers. In Russia, the Mongol occupation shaped what came after. Princes learned to centralize, to tax, to rule with distant authority and close force. The idea that one man might speak for all, even from far away, didn't begin in Moscow. But it found a home there. In China, the Ming dynasty rebuilt. But they kept much of what the Yuan had left. Census structures, postal routes, the habit of ruling through layers of administrators rather than kinship ties. Even the capital, Beijing, remained the centre of power. The walls were rebuilt, but the roads still echoed. In Persia, Mongol rule faded into dynasty, then into story. But their influence remained. The Ilkhanates' embrace of Islam, their support of Persian scholars, Their blend of nomadic pragmatism with bureaucratic precision, it shaped the future. Poets remembered their violence, historians remembered their tolerance. Both were true. The Mongols left few writings of their own, but others wrote about them constantly. In Europe they were feared, then mythologized, sometimes seen as barbarians, sometimes as a kind of mirror, brutal but efficient, foreign yet strangely familiar. Their image shifted with the wind. To some they were God's punishment, to others a sign of what order could look like when enforced without apology. They became a reference point, a story you told when someone asked how fast things could fall apart. And among the Mongols themselves the memory never fully died. They carried it in names, in stories of Genghis Khan told beside firelight, centuries after the empire itself was gone. In Mongolia today, his image is everywhere. Statues, currency, an airport. Not because they remember every campaign, but because they remember what he meant. That the steppe once scattered had moved together. Once. In the end, what the Mongol Empire gave the world was not peace, not prosperity, but connection. A brief, unlikely moment when one system stretched across continents, when roads were open, when news could outpace war. And in the silence that followed, people remembered. It started with a boy, a bow, a promise made beside a dying fire. And from that, an empire. It rose like smoke across the grasslands, slow at first, then sudden, then everywhere. Not with palaces, but with hooves. Not with speeches, but with movement. You've seen it now, from a felt tent in the early morning, to the siege towers outside Zhongdu, to the burning libraries of Baghdad, to the quiet workshops in Samarkand where glass and ink passed hands between strangers. You've watched it stretch, east to west, then crack, then fade. The Mongol Empire didn't leave behind ruins, it left behind roads, names, stories, a world briefly connected, and then let go. Its rulers are gone, its khanate scattered, but the rhythm it imposed, that expectation that one might ride across borders, speak many tongues and be understood, never quite disappeared. Now the steppe is quiet again. Horses still graze, tents still rise and fall with the seasons, but the riders are gone. Their arrows have long since fallen into the dust. Their camps have been folded and packed away, and somewhere out there, beneath the wind, is a grave we never found, marked by nothing, known by no one. But you feel it anyway, because some things don't need monuments, only memory. So now, let it all settle. No more maps, no more roads, no more riding. You're not in the saddle, you're not building an empire, you're done. Take a breath. The fire is low, the guards are quiet, and the world for once is still. Sleep well, the Khans can wait.